students, welcome back to my class. Today we are going to begin the critical paper from your 6th semester. The critical papers are dealing with various critical ideas coming from the classical period to the modern period, and being highly discursive these topics, the limitation of our time will not allow us to discuss elaborately everything about a particular critic or his ideas. So, we will confine ourselves to the particular prescribed topics given in your syllabus and the books that are being produced for this specific syllabus in your university. So, today we will take on the classical critic Plato, on poets and poetry, on mimesis and representation. So, Plato, as we know, was a pupil of Socrates, and he was deeply influenced by him, and he was the famous Athenian philosopher and the author of dialogues. Like Socrates, he believed in the supremacy of reason as the guiding factor in life. In dialogues, he followed the Socratic method of questions and answers in order to arrive at the truth. And the leading character in dialogues is named Socrates. So, Plato was a philosopher in his own right, and he evolved a system of philosophy that is known as Platonism. And he gave paramount importance to the form and the systematic delineation of the form. His original name was Aristocles, and he was influenced by not only Socrates, whom many consider as his teacher, but also by other people from Pythagoras to Homer and so many. So, in your syllabus, the ideas on poets and poetry being taken from chapter 10 of the Republic, which is presented in the form of a dialogue. And here Plato is beginning the discussion of these ideas on poet and poetry by creating a conversation between Socrates, the philosopher, and the rhapsodist Ion. The rhapsodist, as you know, these are the characters who were associated with the poets in the classical period and who interpreted the poets in various public demonstrations, and they were considered as the celebrities of knowing about various aspects of poetry and the poets. But in this dialogue that is presented for your syllabus, we come across the interaction between Socrates and Ion, and Socrates is telling, I often envy the profession of a rhapsode, Ion, for you have always to wear fine clothes and to look as beautiful as you can is a part of your art. So, in this way he is describing the rhapsodist Ion, and Ion was the champion rhapsodist of Athens. And further he is elaborating that The gift which you possess of speaking excellently about Homer is not an art, but as I was just saying, an inspiration. There is a divinity moving you. So he is telling Ion that your excellence in presenting Homer or interpreting Homer and his poetry is actually a divine power that is within you. For all good poets, epic as well as lyric, compose their beautiful poems not by art but because they are inspired and possessed. So, Plato subscribed to the idea that good poets never compose their beautiful poems by any art, but rather through inspiration or the divine power that is being possessed. So he is telling, I quote, "For the poet is a light and winged and holy thing, and there is no invention in him until he has been inspired and is out of his senses, and the mind is no longer in him when he has not attained to this state. He is powerless and is unable to utter his oracles." So Plato strongly believes that the poet is a divinely inspired soul. Without the inspiration of the divinity, the poet is an ordinary soul, and when he is inspired, only then he is out of his senses, his ordinary mundane senses, and his ordinary mundane mind is also not within him. Then only he attains the state of being a poet. Otherwise, he is powerless and he cannot utter his oracles. And further elaborating that, he is telling that the poets, even like Homer, whom Plato considered as one of the best poets of the time, they do not speak of them by any rules of art. They are simply inspired to utter that to which the muse impels them, and that only, and when inspired, one of them will make dithyrambics, another hymns of praise, another choral strains, another epic or iambic verses. And he who is good at one is not good at any other kind of verse. And he is also very particularly distinguishing between different types of poets. The poets who compose dithyrambics or the hymns of praise or the choral strains or the epic or iambic verses, they may be different. One poet may not be able to compose all these varieties of poetry. And then he is telling that in this way the God would seem to indicate to us and not allow us to doubt that these beautiful poems are not human or the work of man, but divine and the work of God, and that the poets are only the interpreters of the gods by whom they are severally possessed. So, the work of poetry is divine and it is a work of God. That is the opinion of Plato, you remember. And the poets, who are the poets then? The poets are only the interpreters of the gods by whom they are severally possessed. So, one more question can be asked. Who are the poets? The poets are the interpreters of the gods. And further he is telling that when the God intended to teach by the mouth of the worst poets, he sang the best of the songs. That it is not the poet who is best or not, but it is the divine inspiration that makes the distinction between the different levels of poetry or different levels of poets. And Socrates is, the character Socrates in this dialogue is further telling that you rhapsodists are the interpreters of the poets. then you are the interpreters of interpreters. So, who is a rhapsodist? Rhapsodist is an interpreter of the interpreter, because the poet is the interpreter of the God's idea. So, in this way, in the book Ion, Plato is presenting about poets. Who are the poets? Then he is continuing to define poetry, and he is telling that of the many excellences which I perceive in order of our state, there is none which upon reflection pleases me better than the rule about poetry. He is defining poetry, and he is telling that poetry is the best of human creations. And he is telling that poetry is the imitative poetry. Poetry is always imitative, it imitates. And he is further elaborating about the imitation by telling that I do not mind saying to you that all poetical imitations are ruinous to the understanding of the hearers, and that the knowledge of their true nature is the only antidote to them. That Plato was an idealist as a philosopher, and he believed that any imitative person or any imitative art or any imitation are not representing the reality, therefore it is ruinous to the understanding of the hearers. Therefore, people should know, or the knowledge of the true nature should be there, which will only work as the antidote. And further elaborating the concept of imitation is giving the example of a painter and the poet who is looking at the painting and creating poetry. He is telling, by giving the idea of a bed and the other of a table, and he is telling that the maker of either of them makes a bed or he makes a table for our use in accordance with the idea. That is our way of speaking in this and similar instances, but no artificer makes the ideas themselves. So, he is telling there is a distinction between the idea and the presentation, and there is the artist and the painter. The painter too is, as I conceive, just such another, a creator of appearances. He is telling that initially it is the God who is having the idea, and God creates the images in nature, maybe a table or a bed, and that is being imitated by the carpenter. The carpenter, being another imitator, again creates another set of appearance, not exactly the idea that is there in the mind of the God or the original creator. And his appearances, his created appearances, are also different from that of the appearances that is made by the God in the nature. And when the painter paints the table or the bed that is made by the carpenter, there is another set of imitation, and again the idea is somewhere being kept at abeyance, and the images are being, or the appearances are being created. So, he is telling that the work of the painter is a third imitation. Then the imitator, I quote, I said, is a long way off the truth, and can do all things because he lightly touches on a small part of them, and that part an image. For example, a painter will paint a cobbler, carpenter, or any other artist, though he knows nothing of their arts. And if he is a good artist, he may deceive children or simple person. So, a painter can paint the image of anyone without knowing them thoroughly. And when we look at the painting, we are easily swayed by the presentation of the appearances, and we are deceived, because the appearance or the image that is presented by the painter is not the reality. So, we can only imagine to be a simple creature who is likely to have been deceived by some wizard or an actor whom he met and whom he thought all knowing, because he himself was unable to analyze the nature of knowledge and ignorance and imitation. So, Plato's point of view was that art deceives. So, we know in his ideal republic, he wanted to banish all the artists, because art is not the truth, art is not the reality, art is presenting only an imitation of that reality, which is very deceptive. Question can be asked that why Plato wanted to banish the artists and the poets from his ideal republic, because in his ideal republic he wanted to stress on the truth or the reality, because you know, as the original creator of the academy, his institution, he wanted that nobody should enter, let no one ignorant of geometry enter. That means he wanted that everyone who is only acquainted with the reality and the beauty of form can be able to accept the knowledge, and they should only be accepted in his academy. And similarly, in his ideal republic, he wanted that the reality must prevail, the truth must prevail. And as a result, what he is trying to derive? So, he is telling even Homer, who is at their head, means he was the best of the poets of the time, know all the arts and all things human, virtue as well as vice and divine things too, for that the good poet cannot compose well unless he knows his subject. And he is telling a good poet, he must know his subject well, otherwise he cannot compose. He must know the binaries of life. He must know comprehensively about everything. If he knows the reality or the idea, he also must know about the appearance as well as what is not reality. And further he is telling that the work of the poet or the artist is the imitations thrice removed from the truth or reality, and could easily be made without any knowledge of the truth, because they are appearances only and not realities. So, in this way Plato gives the idea of imitation by telling the imitation in poetry is 3 times removed from the reality. Then how it is 3 times removed from the reality? Because the reality lies within the mind of the original creator or the God, from where the imitations are coming. The God himself had imitated in the appearance of the nature, then it was imitated by the carpenter or anyone else, and from that the painter, and from that the poet. So, in this way he is telling that the works of art are imitations 3 times removed from the truth. So, in this way, in the book Republic, he is stressing that the artists must not be allowed in the ideal republic. And Plato, as he was influenced by Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher and mathematician of uh, uh, 6th century BC, so he also said that the beauty of form must be stressed, and he found beauty in the isosceles triangle because of the constancy of the relation between the sides and the angles. And Platonism therefore means formalism in the concept of beauty. And his attitude to art and poetry was ambivalent. As a philosopher, he took an antithetical view of art and poetry. Plato's ideas about poet and poetry is thus very clear. He clearly argued that the value of poetry is essentially because of the moral values it encodes and not because of something that the poet has himself brought about by his talent or craft. So, he is not giving importance to the talent or craft of the poet because poet is divinely inspired. Rather, he is emphasizing on the moral aspect of poetry. He is telling that it is the moral values encoded. Poetry is moral values encoded. So, from that point of view, Plato is a moral philosopher. He accused the poets and dramatists of giving descriptions of a crowd of anthropomorphic, deceitful, and revengeful deities instead of representing God as good and source of all good. Excuse me. And further, he is telling that all poetical imitations are ruinous to the understanding of the hearers. Art is the production of images of likeness to reality. It is a work of producing illusions. The imitator is a long way off the truth and can do all things because he touches on a small part of them and that part an image. And as an exponent of expressive theory, Plato proceeds from divine madness that seizes the poet. He also upheld the affective theory, but he was firmly of the view that poetry affects adversely the minds of the hearers. His approach to the mimetic theory was similar. His opinion was that art is 3 times removed from reality and is more or less an illusion. So, in this way, Platonism, with its emphasis on formalism in the treatment of beauty and soul relationship in the treatment of love, has made a significant contribution in the field of literary criticism. But Plato's theory and art is just an imitation is rather one-sided. It ignores creative aspect of the art. This theory was modified by his pupil Aristotle and later by Coleridge. Apart from these specific points, what is really significant is that Plato's wisdom as revealed in dialogues has acted as a beacon light for all later critics. So, this is the idea of Plato's views on poetry and poet and the mimesis. Mimesis means it is the art of imitation, because the word mimesis, it has originated from mimicry. As you know that mimicry, it is the word used when in those days in the classical period, particularly the sheep were brought for sacrifice. They were crying, and the people present in the amphitheater, they were imitating that cry of the sheep, and from that came the word mimicry. From that mimicry, the word mimesis was originated. So, In this way, he is presenting his theory of mimicry or imitation and his ideas on poets and poetry and representation. So, from your paper, the question can be asked that what are Plato's views on poetry and the nature of poetic composition, which already I have discussed, and the question also could be about Plato's views on mimesis. Short questions will be asked only. Plato's ideas of mimesis or imitation, or what is Plato's theory of imitation. And the question also could be asked about how does Plato use the Socratic mode of questioning to challenge the effectiveness of interpretation in Ion, or why Plato used the Socratic mode of questioning. So, you know that Socrates, the philosopher, he used to question his listeners, and he encouraged people to question because he was trying to create the knowledge by discussion. Therefore, Plato had taken the same method because in those days knowledge was not absolute and the philosophical knowledge was being created through the discussions. Therefore, he had adopted this Socratic mode of questioning. So, in this way you can answer the questions that already I have discussed. And finally, again I am repeating everything in a very brief manner that for Plato, the actual nature of the world must be understood in the terms of the idea of the thing and not as it appears. So, he makes a difference between idea and appearance, and he is telling that the poet is an ordinary person, but when he is inspired by the divinity, he interprets the idea into appearance. And he argues that it is very important for the individual to be able to distinguish the object in terms of the idea it comes from. So, as an ideal philosopher or philosopher of idealism, he emphasized on the original idea, and at the same time he is also telling that poets aimed at truthful representation of the world they see, but that being removed from the idea, it takes the poet further away from what is real. What poets end up doing then is to engage in some form of deception. Poetic truth thus is a form of misrepresentation which can have no place in the ideal state. Already I have said it, that why he wanted to banish the poets from his ideal state of republic, that because poetic truth is a form of misrepresentation which can have no place in the ideal state. The Platonic orientation of reality and mode of representation adopted by the poet is one of the first statement of the idealistic position in the Western critical tradition. So, I think you will be able to answer your questions from this particular chapter. Only 5 mark questions, 2 mark or 1 mark questions will be asked. So, I think that you will be able to do justice to your answers by sticking to what I have already discussed here. Thank you.